Welcome to Business Beyond the Mic, where we join Carly Van Heerden, CEO and founder of We Edit Podcasts. Together, let's uncover the art of podcasting.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. I'm your host, Carly Van Heerden. Today on the show, we welcome Amina AlTai. Amina is a holistic business and career coach, proud immigrant, and chronic illness advocate. As a leading coach to notable leaders, executives, and founders, Amina's mastery is in connecting us to our brilliance and teaching us to live and lead from it each day. As a woman of color of Iraqi descent, she often works with marginalized communities to help them realize possibilities in a way that honors their particular lived experiences. She is the author of the forthcoming book, The Ambition Trap, and the host of the Amina Change Your Life podcast. Amina has partnered with progressive companies such as Google, Roku, Deloitte, Snap, Outdoor Voices, NYU, and Huge. She's an Entrepreneur Magazine expert in residence, a Forbes contributor, and was named one of Success Magazine's Women of Influence. Additionally, she's been featured in Goop, Well and Good, The New York Times, Yahoo, NBC, and more. During our conversation, Amina shares the importance of adopting a beginner's mindset when you set out on the road to becoming a podcaster. Allow yourself to be a student before you can actually be great at something. She also shares the importance of using your podcast as a powerful lead gen to bring in new clients. From there, Amina shares her process for creating a structure for her podcast and what it looks like when you finally find that pattern of topics that truly resonates with your audience. She also reminds us to be agile when it comes to your podcasting journey. It might not turn out how you imagined in the beginning. There may be a few plot twists along the way, but that's okay. I can't wait to get into this conversation, so let's jump in. Amina, welcome to Business Beyond the Mic. It is so great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Well, I am so excited for this episode. I mean, just diving into your podcast and your episodes, you are an incredible teacher. So I know that you are going to be the most amazing teacher for our listeners today. But then why don't you just kick us off with telling us a bit more about yourself, your business, your brand, and of course, your podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I am an executive coach and I work with everybody from career pivoters to founders to Fortune 100 leaders and everybody in between. And I have the most amazing clients and I feel so lucky to do this work. And I actually came to this work because I was very unhappy in my career for a very long time. And so I started amassing all these tools to really shift and help in my own life. And after several years really kind of using these tools myself, decided that I wanted to put them together and offer them to other people. And so I've been coaching for the last 8 years. Prior to that, I worked in marketing and brand management. And my brand is really about empowering visionary leaders to find career fulfillment and contentment, because most of the people that I coach are really high achieving, very ambitious, and we're always chasing the next goal and the next goal and the next goal. And it often feels like nothing's ever enough and we never find that happiness or that contentment. So really helping people look at their businesses and their careers a bit more holistically so they can find that contentment, that peace in them. And the podcast has been a natural extension of the work. So to promote my own business throughout the years, I had been on other people's podcasts. And interestingly, my 2 biggest referral sources were past clients referring me and podcasts. And so I saw that in my data and I was like, wow, podcasts actually really support my business. What would it be like if I had my own? And so that's when last year I sat down and introduced my own podcast, Amina Change Your Life.
Yes. Oh, I love the play on the name, and it is just so creative and totally aligned with who you are and what you have to offer, not only your clients, but whoever's listening into the show. Yeah. So I just love that you talk a lot about purpose, and I've been listening to some of your episodes. And how did you know that this aligned with that purpose, launching this podcast just really as that extension, as you mentioned?
Yeah. So in my work, I created this 5-part framework around purpose, and I'm happy to share a link to a workbook to listeners if they're interested. And in that 5-part framework, I say that our purpose is the intersection of where our gifts are, so like what we're genius at, what we value in this world, what meets our needs, what brings us joy, and what we want to impact. And when we touch all 5 of those areas at the same time, we know that we are connecting with our purpose. And so when I was thinking about the podcast, I was like, okay, I know speaking is one of my gifts. It brings me joy to share and teach. It meets my needs because it fills my funnel. It's connected to the impact that I want to have because I can reach more people. And that's something that I've really wanted to do. And so for me, it was really touching all these 5 parts of the framework. It was very values aligned as well. And so it was just so clear that that was really the next step for me. Not only did it make business sense, but it really was connected to my purpose.
Yes, totally. And it's just exactly what you said there. It made total sense for you and your business as well. But I'm just curious to find, was there any struggles that you faced when you were starting this podcast? Was it something that you found easy to add onto your business, or what obstacles did you face in the beginning?
Yeah. Well, first I had major imposter syndrome. I was like, oh my gosh, it's so scary to put this out into the world. What if people don't like it? So I had to do a lot of mindset work to really get my head right, to feel like I could do this and do this well. And it was also a mindset shift to allow myself to be a beginner again, because I've been a coach for the last 8 or 9 years. I haven't been new at something for quite some time. And it really does take something to shift back into that beginner's mindset and allow yourself to actually be bad at something before you can be great at something. And so it was very humbling. Wow, like I'm actually not so great at this. And then I was speaking to a bunch of other podcasters, a lot of my friends at podcasts, and they were all saying, they're like, my early catalog is so embarrassing for me. I feel exactly the same way. I had to start at the bottom and now I've gotten better. But I think that's true for so many of us. Like we have to go back to that learner's mindset and be bad at something before we can be good at something. And so that part, I think, was one of the most challenging parts for me. There's also a time component of, I have a pretty big coaching schedule and speaking schedule. And so making sure that I can consistently record and do so well, I think is another one of the challenges that I'm always finessing.
Yes, no, totally. Because when you start out before that launch date, it's all fun and games. I mean, you're doing your thing, you're interviewing, you're getting all the episodes ready. But once launch has happened, there's no going back, right? Now you have to keep up the schedule. You have to consistently deliver amazing episodes. And yeah, it's a lot for people to kind of understand that concept once the launch has occurred. It's not a stress, but it's something that you have to consider before you dive into your own podcast, as you say. But yeah, was there something you wish you knew before you launched that would have helped you on this journey and overcoming your imposter syndrome?
I think it's one of those journeys that you just have to be on. Like, yes, it would be great if somebody just handed me a toolkit and was like, these are the specific things that you need to do to create a podcast and knock it out of the park. But I didn't find that toolkit. And it would be awesome if somebody also had a mindset toolkit that was like, these are the things that you will need to feel really rooted and grounded as you do this thing. But I think like my perspective with so many things is start with what you can stand in and then do the work that you need to do in place so you can then take the next step. And I think if somebody had handed me the toolkit, I would have skipped a necessary step that I needed to do to learn and to grow. And so I think everything is kind of divinely timed and everything unfolded the way that it needed to. But yeah, sure. I wish that there were some shortcuts and things were a smidge easier. I think one of the other things that I would like to share with people too, because I see this in my coaching practice all the time, people are often afraid to put themselves out there because they're afraid of being in their own bigness because 1, there's the responsibility to keep showing up in that bigness. And 2, I think, especially for women and other historically excluded people, sometimes putting ourselves out there can feel scary because we're afraid that there's going to be some kind of backlash. And I felt that way too. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's going to be like negative reviews or people are going to have really uncomfortable feedback from me. But that's part of our growth. And hopefully we can find a way to do this that feels safe for us, safe in our bodies, safe out in the world. And that's the best thing that we can do.
Yeah, I love that they shared that because it's something that I went through now, even with the launch of my podcast, not only that imposter syndrome, like, why am I allowed to be here, and converting into what I like to call the student mindset to kind of, get into that group. But then once you overcome imposter syndrome, it's just like, what about the feedback, right? You have to almost practice being okay with both negative and positive feedback because that's what's going to happen. And if you're not doing things that are stirring other people or getting people to talk about it, then it's not always going to have the same impact in the end. But yeah, I love that you shared that. It's such a good tip.
Thank you. And what I want to say about that is I teach feedback inside of big organizations, like how to do it well. There is a really nice and healthy way to deliver feedback, and not everybody knows how to deliver it that way. So sometimes the feedback can feel harsh, right? But what I will say is 99% of the time, there's a little bit of gold in there for us, even if it's harsh in its delivery. So see if you can find the gold in it, I think is one of the best things that we can do. And then also, what I want to say too, and maybe this is controversial, I don't know, but some people just aren't going to like us, and that's fine, right? They can like us for no apparent reason. Like maybe our face reminds them of somebody that they don't like, right? There's going to be a reason that somebody doesn't like us, and that's okay, because there are so many other people that appreciate your work and do like you.
Yes, but I mean, that's the thing. You just have to be okay with that and realize you don't have to waste your energy there. You can focus on the people that are benefiting from what you're providing and put all your energy into making great content for those people specifically, which is, great way to shift that focus.
Exactly.
Yeah. Were there any incredible benefits that you found from once you launched your podcast for your business or yourself personally?
I'm a very curious person. I love learning about people. And so I think one of the greatest benefits of being on the podcast has just been having people on that I'm genuinely excited to learn from, and like asking them really exciting questions that just blow my own mind. Like I had a guest on, her name is Kelly Deals, and she talks a lot about economic justice. And it was so fun to have her on the podcast, to pick her brain, to get a sense of her body of work. Like that to me was just delight. And especially as a coach where I am mostly in service to other people, the podcast feels like a place where others sometimes pour into me because I'm learning from them, or I'm getting inspired by them, or it's sparking something. So that's, to me, one of the greatest benefits.
Yes, absolutely. And because then you're getting some time to kind of just stimulate that curiosity and find new ways for yourself to even branch out as a coach, or, just find ways to, foster your creativity when you're finding ways, on the podcast to do that, instead of just being stuck in your own world where you're the one always telling people what to do, which is, I've definitely found that as well with mine. I'm learning a lot on this journey and not taking any of it for granted. It's been amazing. Well, that's the thing when you're having all these different guests on. So oftentimes when you're a podcaster starting out, you're thinking, should I do these single episodes? Should I invite guests on? Then when you make the choice to interview people, not only from a learning perspective, but then how do you kind of shape and garner that content that you're creating or the topics that you're covering to your audience?
Before I started the podcast, I sat down with a podcasting expert that had helped like dozens of people launch their podcast, had their own podcast. And we kind of brainstormed together what we thought were some fun kind of formulas for the episodes, for the structure, and for all of that. And one of the things that we decided from the beginning was that we wanted to kind of break it up, of have interview episodes, solo episodes, a current event hot take, and even test out me live coaching people on the podcast. And all of it was a big test because we're hypothesizing in the beginning of like, we think that people are going to like this, but we literally have no idea. So we started with that formula in mind, and I was quite structured with it, I think probably for the first 20, 24 episodes. And now I've gotten a bit more flexible in there. I'm just letting myself go with what feels exciting and fun, because I think if I'm excited about it, listeners will be excited about it too. So I did start with that structure, but like what is typical to me is like I like to find my own freedom in the structure as well.
Yes. No, I love that. I mean, that's the thing. Depending on your personality, it comes down to knowing yourself as the podcast host, as the podcaster. Do you thrive with that structure, or do you thrive when you're just winging it, going off the cuff? And that comes down to knowing yourself before, diving into these things. But it's kind of fun to find out what you're good at, right?
It really is. Yeah. I'm not so good at. That's also very freeing, right? And it's like, I'm not so good at this thing. I'm going to bring somebody in that does this thing really well because it's not me.
Yeah, no, totally. But no, when you look at the podcast, we were talking beforehand and talking about different ways to monetize. And sometimes that's in line with your goals, but sometimes it isn't. So then when you're looking at your metrics or what you decide as a successful thing for your podcast, how can you tell that you're heading home, you're really finding your groove with your podcast and making it work for yourself and your business?
Yeah. So a lot of the times I think we look solely at data, right? But data can sometimes be biased. And I think that that's an important thing for us to remember, that data isn't the be all end all. I like to look at qualitative and quantitative data. So I will look at the downloads. I'll look at the feedback. I'll look at the reviews. Oftentimes people will DM me or message me directly and tell me, this thing really resonated, or somebody will screenshot something in social. So it's a less, a formal way of receiving feedback, but it's feedback nonetheless. And so I'm looking at all of that of what's the sentiment? What are the downloads? Are these specific topics resonating? And also like, I'll see there's patterns. There's some topics that people I think by far and away want to hear about. Any topic or any podcast episode where we touched on nervous system work or somatic work are some of the most popular episodes that we've had. And so that to me says, okay, this is hot. Maybe want to dig a little deeper here and think about other ways and other guests that we can bring people on. But I'm really looking at that holistically. And then I always do a gut check too of like, is this interesting to me? Is this something that I would want to learn about? Because I'm a student in the journey as well. And so looking at the data, but making sure that the data isn't the be all end all.
Yeah, no, totally. And do you use it as, I know you mentioned before we hopped on, you mentioned that your podcast has really been working for your business as a lead magnet, as a way to generate new potential clients, people interested in your coaching, your services that you offer. How do you, when you chat to those people that find you that way, how do they say that it's impacted their choice to kind of go with you, right?
What's great about the podcast is people can spend time with you without spending time with you. So people will come into sessions and they'll say, okay, listen to your podcast. Then I went and I heard you on these other people's podcasts. And I really loved this part of the conversation. And this is what I want to talk to you more about. So it's almost like so much hard work has already been done and they've been nurtured in a way that they come into a session with me or they come into a consult with me and they already have an intent to work with me because the podcast has done some of that heavy lifting, which is so cool, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I would say like maybe 50-60% of people that come in have already made a decision about if they want to work with me or not because of that nurturing that happens beforehand.
Yeah, totally. Because it's more like, yeah, you can get to know the host or the person that you want to work with before even deciding to make that choice and, you know, giving the investment of it, which is amazing because you use it as a platform to teach before they even get into your sessions. And now they've already got that groundwork that you want to lay and you can go so much further with them beyond even that.
Yes. The other way that I use my podcast too, so it's fantastic for lead gen and nurturing people. And I'll often in an episode mention a resource like a guide or a workbook that I have. So then I can also acquire their email address. And then that drops them into a welcome series that happens through my email service provider. But also a great thing with the podcast too is I can send it as complimentary or supplementary info for my existing clients or just other people out in the world. Somebody might be like, oh, like, how do we find our zone of genius? I'm like, listen to episode 3. Yes. Or, you know, how do we use somatic tools in our practice? Okay, listen to episode 15, you know, so I can point to it as resources. So again, it kind of takes some of the heavy lift off of me in my coaching or when I'm out in the world.
Yeah, it's essentially become like a catalog of your teachings and you have it all organized and people can just go directly to that, which is great because that's the thing. You get a lot of questions and sometimes it's repetitive questions. And the best way to answer that is through a broadcast, basically, which is
exactly.
Your podcast. Yeah, that's incredible. Well, is there anything that you would like to share with our listeners today that you found the most helpful on your journey, whether it be the idea to get someone to work with you on the launch, to get like a coach for your podcast? What advice would you give them today?
It was very helpful to have some people support me in the launch. And so, like I mentioned, I sat down with somebody that had helped people launch podcasts before. That was really helpful to do because they've done this so many times. They knew exactly the tools to point me to. I had to trial and error a little bit and see what worked for me, but it was a great starting point. And it was someone that I could also bounce ideas off of. And I work really well that way. So it was very nice to have that. I also say have a great producer/editor from the beginning. That's something that's very important to me. My producer/editor is amazing and does such an incredible job. And so I just feel so supported in that. And I could not launch this podcast if I wasn't supported. So make sure that you have the team there for you. But the other thing I'll say is be agile, right? We all have these ideas of how we want the podcast to be or what we want it to do in the world. It's probably going to twist and it's probably going to be something different, like most things that we put out in the world. I was interviewing somebody for my podcast yesterday and she had a very successful podcast and she got over 100,000 followers on Instagram just for the podcast alone outside of her own channel. And then she decided, she's like, actually, this doesn't fulfill me anymore. And I noticed that the numbers are dropping. So I'm actually going to start a new podcast. And so just being agile because it's going to take different shapes and forms. And the more rigid we are, the more we try to control it, oftentimes the more things will break. And so allow it to be what it's meant to be in the world. It will be on its own journey. And I think that's been very helpful for me. Of like, I don't have to control this. It's going to unfold into what it's meant to unfold into. And as long as I'm having a good time and it's still feeling purpose aligned for me, like we started the conversation talking about, right. I feel great about it.
Yes, absolutely. And it's that agility that'll allow you to keep going with your purpose, right? If you get stuck in what you think it should be, it might no longer be aligned with your purpose, and you will lose that joy. And I've heard so many podcasters tell me that before. I was so strict with my metrics, with my goals, and it just took the joy out of it. And the only way I could get back that magic of podcasting was to just be agile, pivot, make some changes, and really find, what I was meant to do here behind this mic and connecting with people. You mentioned before that you guys trialed doing live or like tested out the hypothesis of doing live podcasts. Did you ever get around to doing a live podcast?
So we did live coaching episodes where I'd have somebody come on, like a past client, and bring in a particular issue, and then we would coach through it right then and there. And so, we would still edit them. So it wasn't really live, but it was coaching in the moment.
Right.
And that was just super interesting. And I wanted to see if that was an enjoyable listen and if people got stuff out of that. From the data, from what we heard, people liked them. And so, that might be something that we do more of, but I was just really curious to see how they'd land and how they'd feel for everybody. But I haven't done officially live, unedited podcast yet.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Some people say that's where they feel most at home. And I'm like, I have a ways to go before I get to the live podcast, even though it kind of does feel live because you are doing this especially with me with video, it feels really way more live. But yeah,
agreed.
It'd be interesting to have an audience and be able to ask them questions, or they can ask us questions, right? That's such a fun thing to think about for the future.
Yes. One of my teachers and mentors, she has a podcast and she's on a podcast tour right now, and they're literally having events where they have 100 people in the room and they're recording right there. And I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Definitely something to aspire to for sure.
Yeah. Podcast tour. That sounds incredible. I guess you always hear a book tour, but yeah, I've never
heard. Why not a podcast tour?
Yeah, why not a podcast tour? Well, that's the thing. Your book is coming out, soon, maybe. You just handed in your first draft. Congratulations on that. That is incredible. I'm excited to watch your journey on that more and just see how it all turns out. Maybe you can add your podcast tour in with your book there.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Right. They can serve each other for sure.
Right, totally. Well, Amina, this has been incredible so far. You are such a great teacher, as I mentioned. Yeah, just so great to have you. And now I want to jump into the fun questions for the interview. So just going to ask them, and whatever pops to mind, you can expand or not expand. It's up to you. This is where we free flow and have some fun. So the first question is, how has the podcast changed the way you do business or life?
Interesting question. So I think that it's definitely brought a bit more rigor to my schedule in terms of needing to make sure that there's time in there to be consistent with this. But I think in terms of what it's added to my life is what we were talking about before. Like, it's added that spark of curiosity, that excitement of just getting to meet new people. And I think that's one of the best pieces. Yes, I had some business goals in mind when I set up the podcast. However, I think one of the most nutritive and nourishing pieces of it has been just meeting these amazing people and just following the thread of curiosity.
That's so good. Yeah. And that curiosity is going to keep growing, I think. Okay. Number 2, what is a non-negotiable investment or some of your top tools as a podcaster?
Definitely having producer/editor. I would be lost without my production person. They're amazing. And then tools that we use Riverside for recording. And then I use Capsho for show notes. Those have been supportive. And maybe we shift sometime. Maybe we stay with them. Not sure. But right now they're serving the podcast with the size that it is. And so, those have been helpful and supportive.
Amazing. Now, we've talked about a lot of success for your podcast. What was one of your biggest podcast fails or something that didn't go as planned?
Yeah. Taking a long pause here. I'm like, what didn't go as planned?
It doesn't have to be something, right? You could be nothing. Or one of the most unexpected things that you got from your podcast.
I think what's really interesting about the podcast is that I'm not a consistent person. And, I think a lot of the time we punish ourselves for being inconsistent, but I actually think many of us are inconsistent, and it's better to work with our energy than to fight it. But the podcast does require a degree of consistency. And I think that I wouldn't call it a failure, but I think one of the challenges I experience is the consistency element, because I love to work in sprints of like, yeah, let me record like 10 and then I'm going to take off for like a month, and then I'm going to record 10 and take off for another month. But with people's schedules, that doesn't always work. So it's required a consistency that I think is just stretching me. It's a growth edge for me.
Yeah, totally. And that consistency comes again down to who you are as a person. Like if that's what you need is the break, then, batch your episodes and find your energy again so you can keep going the next time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So my last question is fun. It's like, if money or time were not an issue or a factor, what would be next for your podcast?
I would love to have like a full set, like big production. And yeah, just like literally have an amazing team where we're video, audio recording, and it's essentially like a mini talk show.
Yes.
That's what I would love. I think something like Marie Forleo's Marie TV was a great example, but essentially full set, full crew, video, audio, just making magic like it's a talk show would be amazing.
Yes, I can totally imagine that. You can have hair and makeup, all the lights.
Fun, right?
Yes.
So fun.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I will keep an eye out for your live talk TV show. Thanks so much for everything that you've shared with the listeners today. It's been a great example of how to stay in your purpose and really just find what makes podcasting fun and enjoyable and curious and stimulating that curiosity. So Amina, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been an absolute joy to be here. The work that you do is incredible, and I'm just so grateful that I got to sit down with you and share my perspective. You are amazing.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will see you next time.